Right now, the Atlantic hurricane season is moving toward the point in the calendar where a lot of people start making one very dangerous mistake. They look at the basin, they see that it has not exploded with constant storm activity yet. They hear that forecasters are expecting a below normal season, and they quietly start to relax. That is exactly the wrong reaction. Because the Atlantic hurricane season is now entering the phase where the background conditions matter more, the long-range signals begin to interact with the hottest part of the year. Tropical waves coming off Africa start becoming more important, and one quiet stretch can give way to a very different pattern faster than most people expect. So if you live anywhere near the Gulf Coast, the Caribbean, the Bahamas, the southeast coast of the United States, Mexico, Central America, or the islands scattered across the Atlantic, this is the moment to pay closer attention, not less. The first thing you need to understand is that a seasonal outlook does not protect anyone. NOAA has forecast a 55% chance of a below normal Atlantic season, a 35% chance of a near normal season, and only a 10% chance of an above normal season. Their projected range is 8 to 14 named storms, 3 to 6 hurricanes, and 1 to 3 major hurricanes. Colorado State University has gone even lower in its July update, forecasting 9 named storms, 4 hurricanes, and just 1 major hurricane, with an accumulated cyclone energy value of 50 compared with an average of 123. On paper, that sounds reassuring. It sounds like the ocean is taking a year off. It sounds like a season where maybe the danger is smaller, but that is not what these numbers mean in the real world. What they mean is that the basin may produce fewer total storms than usual. They do not mean your coastline is safe. They do not mean your city cannot take a direct hit. And they definitely do not mean the atmosphere cannot suddenly align for one storm that changes everything. That is why forecasters keep repeating the same warning every single year. It only takes one storm. That phrase gets used so often that some people stop hearing it, but it is still the most important sentence of the entire season. NOAA has said very clearly that its outlook is not a landfall forecast. It does not tell you where storms will go. It does not tell you which coastlines might end up in the crosshairs. Colorado State University also emphasized that even with a well below average landfall probability, coastal residents should prepare every season, regardless of predicted activity. That message matters because the atmosphere does not care how comforting the preseason numbers looked in May or July. If one hurricane finds a favorable pocket of water, lower shear, adequate moisture, and a steering pattern that sends it toward land, then your season stops being average or below average. It becomes personal immediately. And this is exactly why the phrase entering a critical phase is not hype. It is climatology. The Atlantic season officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. But NOAA's climatology shows that the real peak is September 10th, and that most activity happens between mid-August and mid-October. The average first-named storm usually forms in mid to late June. The average first hurricane tends to form in early to mid-August, and the average first major hurricane usually forms in late August or early September. In other words, the season has a structure. Early summer can be deceptive. Activity can be sparse, scattered, disorganized, and frustrating for storm watchers. But once the calendar starts pushing deeper toward August and then September, the basin moves into the window where the atmosphere and the ocean historically become much more capable of supporting serious development. That critical phase is not about a switch flipping overnight. It is about ingredients gradually lining up. Ocean temperatures remain warm enough over broad areas to support deep tropical convection. The main development region, the stretch of the tropical Atlantic that often becomes a factory for long-track storms, becomes more relevant. Tropical waves rolling off Africa have more room and more time over water to organize. The steering currents begin to matter more for the Caribbean, the Lesser Antilles, the open Atlantic, and eventually the Western Basin. And because the most dangerous storms often need time, space, and favorable structure to mature, the shift from a sleepy basin to a high concern basin can happen with very little emotional warning for the public. One week, people are saying the season looks quiet. Then suddenly a wave near the Cabo Verde Islands is getting named, models begin clustering, and now everyone from the islands to the Gulf is checking spaghetti plots every few hours. But this year there is another layer to the story, and it is the reason so many people have been tempted to relax. El Niño is expected to emerge and intensify during the season, and forecasters from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center have placed a huge amount of weight on that signal. Their outlook says there is a 98% chance El Niño conditions occur during the hurricane season, with a very high likelihood of at least a moderate event during the peak months. Colorado State University says moderate El Niño conditions are likely to intensify over the next few months, with high potential for a strong El Niño at the peak of the season. That matters because El Niño usually increases vertical wind shear across the tropical Atlantic and Caribbean, and vertical wind shear is one of the biggest enemies a developing storm can face. If you are not familiar with that term, vertical wind shear simply means the wind changes too much with height. Tropical cyclones need a fairly aligned vertical structure to organize. They want thunderstorms to build over warm water, release heat, lower pressure, and stack efficiently. But when stronger winds aloft start pushing the tops of those thunderstorms away from the lower level circulation, the storm loses symmetry, loses focus, and often loses the chance to intensify. NOAA's Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory explains that El Niño typically lessens Atlantic hurricane activity by increasing this vertical wind shear, making it harder for thunderstorms to organize into tropical storms and hurricanes. That is the atmospheric tax every developing system may have to pay this year. And if the shear is strong enough, many disturbances simply never become memorable. So if El Niño is such a strong suppressor, why are forecasters still telling people to stay sharp? Because suppression is not cancellation, it is resistance. And resistance in the atmosphere is rarely uniform across every location and every week of an entire season. There can still be windows where shear relaxes, where local moisture improves, where a storm forms farther north or west in a slightly more favorable pocket, or where a disturbance organizes quickly before the hostile pattern fully tears it apart. Weather.com pointed out that wind shear over the Caribbean in early July was the second highest on record for that time of year, which is one reason the basin has remained relatively quiet. But the same reporting also stressed that even a less active season can still be dangerous, and that history is full of El Niño seasons that still produced impactful storms and landfalls. That is where a lot of people get fooled by the word below normal. They interpret it emotionally instead of statistically. They hear fewer storms and imagine less danger. But hurricanes do not distribute risk fairly. A season can be inactive over most of the basin and still brutal for the one place that gets hit. In fact, quieter seasons can sometimes create a false sense of security that makes the public slower to react when the real threat finally appears. If the first big serious storm of the year does not arrive until later, people can become mentally lazy. Supplies remain unpurchased, plans remain unfinished, evacuation decisions remain vague. And then suddenly, the atmosphere delivers a storm during the most favorable part of the calendar, and now millions of people are trying to compress weeks of preparation into 48 hours. We already had a reminder of that kind of danger earlier in the season. Weather.com noted that Tropical Storm Arthur was not especially well organized, but it still produced catastrophic flooding rain in Louisiana, breaking the state's all-time 24-hour rainfall record and delivering the wettest June day on record in New Orleans. That is one of the most important lessons of hurricane season, and one of the easiest to forget. You do not need a major hurricane to create major impacts. A modest tropical storm, a weakly organized system, or even a slow-moving rainmaker can still flood neighborhoods, overwhelm drainage, strand families, and produce losses people remember for years. So if a storm does not look cinematic on satellite, that does not mean it is harmless. And this is why the current quiet should not be mistaken for safety. As of the latest National Hurricane Center outlook, there are no major organized cyclones dominating the Atlantic, but forecasters are watching two areas. One is a tropical wave southeast of the Cabo Verde Islands with only a 10% chance of formation in both the short term and over 7 days. The other is a low expected to form over the northeastern Gulf, carrying a low 7-day formation chance of 20% as it drifts toward the southeastern United States. On the surface, those are not dramatic numbers, but the presence of even low-end monitored areas is a reminder that the basin never truly turns off. It tests the edges of development constantly, and one of the hardest parts of this season is knowing when those low-probability seeds begin to enter a more supportive environment. The phrase, "what forecasters are watching," matters here, because forecasting hurricane season is never just about counting storms. It is about tracking the battle between large-scale suppressors and local-scale opportunities. Right now, forecasters are watching El Niño. They are watching vertical wind shear. They are watching Atlantic sea surface temperatures, which are warmer than average in some places, but more mixed than in recent hyperactive seasons. They are watching the main development region. They are watching the West African monsoon, because the quality and structure of tropical waves coming off Africa can influence the basin later in the season. They are watching the Saharan air layer, which can inject dry, dusty, stable air over the Atlantic and make development more difficult. And they are watching the calendar itself, because the influence of El Niño on Atlantic hurricanes often becomes more pronounced later, especially from September through November. NOAA's AOML explains that the effects of El Niño on Atlantic hurricanes often become more evident later in the season, especially from September through November. That means the season's most active climatological window overlaps with the period when El Niño may be exerting stronger suppressive influence. On paper, that sounds comforting, but in practice, it can create a very uneven season, with long, quiet stretches interrupted by short windows where one storm still finds room to organize and threaten land. A basin that spends long periods looking quiet and then suddenly produces one serious threat is psychologically dangerous. Communities go from indifference to panic. Emergency managers have to force urgent warnings through public complacency, and by the time that shift happens late in summer, the ocean may be warm enough for far more dangerous behavior than people were mentally prepared for. Colorado State University's July update captures that tension almost perfectly. Their numbers are clearly below average: 9 named storms, 4 hurricanes, 1 major hurricane, AC of 50. Well below average landfall probability. But even in that same outlook, they still remind residents that thorough preparations should be made every season. That is not boilerplate language. That is forecasting experience speaking. Forecasters have seen too many seasons where the aggregate statistics sounded benign, but one storm found the exact corridor it needed. They know that people remember landfalls, not basin-wide seasonal averages. If a storm drives surge into your neighborhood, or rain into your streets, or wind into your roof, nobody in that moment cares that the ACE total was below normal. And while El Niño is the dominant suppressor in the current forecast, it is not the only part of the equation. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center also points to ongoing high-activity era conditions in the Atlantic, including warmer sea surface temperatures and weaker trade winds compared with longer-term climatology, even if those factors are less amplified than in the last few years. Their outlook says sea surface temperatures in the main development region were above average in spring, and models still suggest positive anomalies through the peak of the season. Weather.com also described the Atlantic Ocean temperature pattern as mixed, with parts of the basin from the Azores to Bermuda to the Bahamas warmer than average, while portions of the tropical Atlantic were nearer to average or even a bit cooler in early July. That mixed pattern matters because storms do not need the entire basin to be perfect. They just need a favorable track through supportive water and manageable atmospheric conditions. It is easy to oversimplify this forecast by focusing on one variable, like cooler tropical Atlantic pockets compared with some recent years. But storms are not built from one variable. A weak wave can struggle in one region, reorganize later in another, and threaten land after local conditions improve. And when development happens closer to the Caribbean, Gulf, or Southeast coast, communities have less time to prepare regardless of what happened farther east. That is why the northeastern Gulf area in the current outlook matters even with only a 20% 7-day chance. Not because it is guaranteed to become anything major, but because it illustrates how threats do not have to begin as classic, long-track Cape Verde storms to matter. Some of the most disruptive Atlantic systems develop much closer to land. They can form in the Gulf, near the southeast coast, or in the western Caribbean. And because of that shorter runway, they can move from obscure low pressure to practical threat faster than the public is comfortable with. Even if those systems never become hurricanes, they can still dump rain, produce rough surf, cause coastal flooding, and create travel and infrastructure problems over heavily populated areas. And then there is the other side of the Atlantic story, the side connected to the Cabo Verde Islands and the long east-to-west journey that so often defines the most famous storms. NOAA's climatology says activity rises dramatically as the season deepens toward August and September, and that is when waves rolling off Africa become more central to the conversation. At the moment, the wave southeast of Cabo Verde remains disorganized and is only carrying low odds of development, but meteorologically, it is a signpost. It is the kind of feature forecasters expect to pay more attention to as the season matures. Not every wave matters, most do not. But later in the summer, a healthier wave leaving Africa with enough moisture, lower shear, and warm water ahead of it can become the kind of storm that spends days organizing over open water before threatening the islands, the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Bermuda, or the U.S. coast. That is why this period is so deceptive. The basin is moving from early season suppression toward peak season opportunity. Weather.com said it might still be a while before the next Atlantic tropical storm forms, and that El Niño could keep the basin relatively quiet through the rest of July, perhaps even into August. But August is also when Atlantic activity typically begins rising sharply. That tension between quiet now and higher potential soon is the definition of a critical phase. And I want to slow down on that point because it is where most public misunderstanding begins. A critical phase does not mean forecasters are predicting a disaster tomorrow. It means the background state of the season is shifting into a period where the odds of impactful development increase, even if the total number of storms ends up lower than average. It means emergency managers want preparation decisions made before the emotional urgency arrives. It means meteorologists know that once the basin wakes up, the public can fall behind very fast. The critical phase is not just meteorological, it is behavioral. It is the point where waiting becomes riskier than acting. This is especially true because hurricane impacts are not only about wind speed. When people hear the word hurricane, they often imagine category numbers first. But flooding rain, inland flash flooding, storm surge, rip currents, extended power outages, and infrastructure strain can all become major problems even with systems that are not historically extreme. NOAA's outlook itself highlights preparedness because the danger from tropical cyclones is multidimensional. And Arthur's flooding in Louisiana showed very clearly that a storm does not need to be a powerhouse on the Saffir-Simpson scale to cause record-breaking damage through water. In many situations, rain is the first and worst hazard. In others, surge is the killer. In some cases, a weaker storm moving slowly is far more disruptive for a region than a faster, stronger storm that keeps moving. Another thing forecasters are watching very closely is uncertainty itself. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center says one major uncertainty is exactly how quickly El Niño develops and how strong it becomes. If it emerges later than expected or ends up weaker than expected, Atlantic activity could increase relative to the current forecast. The outlook also notes that local conditions in the Atlantic basin could overwhelm the remote suppressing influence from El Niño. That is a critical sentence, because it is NOAA saying, in scientific language, that the atmosphere does not always obey the clean story people want to hear. There are competing factors, there are moving parts, and sometimes the local favorable ingredients are strong enough to produce meaningful storms, even in a season where the large-scale signal argues for suppression. Colorado State and NOAA are not actually contradicting each other on this. They are describing the same risk from different angles. One angle says the season should be quieter overall because El Niño is likely to generate hostile shear. The other angle says quieter overall does not eliminate the chance of major impacts. And both are true at the same time. The Atlantic basin can be less active than normal and still produce a catastrophic landfall. It can also spend weeks looking unimpressive and then suddenly intensify in relevance as climatology and local conditions align. That is why serious forecasters never talk about a hurricane season as if it were decided once and for all in May. They talk about probabilities, evolving conditions, and the need to stay ready even when the numbers appear favorable. There's also a historical lesson hidden inside these quieter forecast years. When the atmosphere discourages storm formation over broad stretches of the basin, the storms that do manage to form become even more important. There are fewer distractions. Each wave that holds together longer than expected starts getting more attention. Each low-pressure area in the Gulf or Western Atlantic becomes more consequential. Each model signal gets dissected more closely because the basin may not offer many serious candidates, but the one candidate that does survive could matter immensely. In that kind of season, the public can either benefit from the extra lead time and careful monitoring, or they can get caught off guard because they assumed quiet meant finished. And quiet never means finished in July, not in the Atlantic, not with a basin that historically does its heaviest work later. NOAA's climatology is brutally clear on that. The peak is September 10th. Most activity comes between mid-August and mid-October. The first hurricane usually forms in early to mid-August. The first major hurricane usually forms in late August or early September. So if you are sitting in mid-July and telling yourself the season has not done much yet, you are effectively judging a movie before the main plot has started. The atmosphere has not yet entered its most statistically dangerous window. That is why so many forecasters use language like wake up, turning point, or critical phase. They are not saying history guarantees a big storm. They are saying history guarantees the background risk is about to increase. That increase in background risk also has an emotional dimension for coastal communities. There is a huge difference between preparing in calm weather and scrambling under a watch or warning. Calm weather gives you time to review evacuation routes, refill prescriptions, inspect shutters, test generators, update insurance documentation, charge backup batteries, and decide in advance what would make you leave. Storm weather gives you traffic, fuel shortages, crowded stores, mixed messages on social media, and the temptation to make last-minute decisions under stress. That is why the calm part of the season is the most valuable part of the season. Once the basin moves deeper into the critical phase, the window for low-stress preparation starts shrinking. NOAA is also bringing upgraded tools into the 2026 season, including improved cone graphics, AI-based modeling, better flood mapping, and new aircraft and drone data. Those advances matter, but they do not erase uncertainty. Forecasting is getting smarter, while the atmosphere remains messy, which is another reason forecasters stay cautious even in a below-normal outlook year. The season is also critical because the public wants certainty, and the science cannot provide it. The science says activity is likely below normal, but it also says the peak is still ahead. El Niño should suppress some development, local Atlantic conditions can still become favorable, and the basin usually grows more active from mid-August into October. All of those statements can be true at once, and that layered reality is exactly what makes this period so important. So what are forecasters really watching over the next several weeks? They are watching whether El Niño continues intensifying on schedule. They are watching if Caribbean and tropical Atlantic wind shear remains hostile or begins to temporarily relax in key corridors. They are watching whether the tropical Atlantic near Africa stays merely average or becomes more supportive. They are watching the quality of African easterly waves as the calendar advances. They are watching for signs that the Western Atlantic or Gulf could become a more favorable breeding ground for closer-in development. They are watching if Saharan dust continues choking off thunderstorms or starts backing away enough to let deeper convection organize. And they are watching the model guidance for any shift from a sleepy basin to a basin that suddenly has one or two windows of real opportunity. If those windows arrive, everything changes very fast. The same audience that spent weeks hearing that the season looked quiet suddenly wants to know track, intensity, surge, rainfall, evacuation zones, and exact timing. The same communities that had weeks to prepare start checking shelves for bottled water and gasoline. And the same phrase comes roaring back into focus. It only takes one storm. That line sounds ordinary in June. It sounds ominous in late August when a strengthening cyclone is moving through warm water with a more organized inner core. This is why experienced forecasters repeat it relentlessly. Not because repetition is dramatic, but because repetition is necessary. Most people do not fully believe that sentence until they are looking at a cone pointed towards somewhere they know. And for the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, the Southeast, and Atlantic-facing islands, that is reason enough to treat this phase seriously. The basin does not need to produce a record number of storms to produce a record year for one household, one county, one island, or one fishing town. A below-normal season can still test levees, drown roadways, collapse power lines, ruin crops, erode beaches, and shut down ports. A tropical storm can still flood neighborhoods. A Category 1 can still be life-altering. A major hurricane, even if there is only one, can redraw the memory of an entire region. Forecast numbers help describe the odds for the basin. They do not describe the emotional scale of a landfall for the people in its path. So if you have been waiting for a sign that now is the time to take the Atlantic seriously, this is it. Not because a monster storm is guaranteed tomorrow, not because the current outlook is screaming immediate catastrophe, but because the season is moving into the part of the calendar where the background danger rises. The first hurricane climatologically becomes more likely. The first major hurricane seasonally comes into range, and the atmosphere starts offering more chances for one storm to break through. This is the phase where preparation has the highest value, and procrastination starts getting expensive. The smartest way to think about the Atlantic right now is this. The basin is not asleep forever, it is transitioning. El Niño is trying to keep activity contained. Climatology is trying to pull the season toward its peak. Local ocean and atmospheric conditions are mixed, not dead. Monitored systems are still low-end, but the pattern is evolving. The big suppressor is real, but so is the possibility that one or two storms find a favorable lane anyway. And because of that, the correct response is neither panic nor complacency. It is disciplined attention. If the rest of July remains quiet, that does not mean the warning was wrong. It means the warning was timely. If August begins slowly, that does not mean the risk disappeared. It means the basin is still negotiating between hostile shear and seasonal momentum. And if sometime later a storm suddenly begins organizing in the tropical Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Gulf, or just off the southeast coast, then what looked like a quiet year will instantly feel much louder. That is how Atlantic seasons work. They are not judged by how peaceful a few weeks felt in midsummer. They are judged by what happens when the basin enters its most favorable stretch and whether communities were ready when the atmosphere finally made its move. So when you hear that the Atlantic hurricane season is entering a critical phase, hear the full meaning of that sentence. Hear the climatology behind it. Hear the uncertainty behind it. Hear the reminder from NOAA that the peak is still ahead. Hear the signal from Colorado State that even a well below normal seasonal forecast still demands full preparation. Hear the lesson from Arthur that water alone can make a season unforgettable. Hear the current National Hurricane Center outlook saying the basin is quiet but not empty. And most of all, hear the one warning that matters more than all the numbers put together. It only takes one. One storm with enough time, enough water, enough organization, and the wrong track can turn a below normal season into the most important season of your life. That is what forecasters are watching now, and that is why this phase of the Atlantic season matters so much.